Hey guys, what sounds, at first glance, like a simple historical inconvenience was often something much heavier. In the Middle Ages, getting sick did not just mean pain or weakness. It could mean entering a world of uncertainty, strange remedies, spiritual fear, social risk, and long waiting, where even a familiar fever might quietly rearrange the meaning of an entire household. And that makes this story far more uncomfortable and far more human than people often assume. Before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which history topic you'd like me to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quick like is a simple way to support it. And if calm, quietly fascinating history is your kind of evening listening, subscribing is the best way to stay with the channel. Now, to understand what it was like to be sick in the Middle Ages, it helps to begin with something easy to miss. Medieval people were not living in a world without ideas about health. They were living in a world with many ideas about health, some practical, some inherited from ancient authorities, some religious, some local, and many deeply shaped by the limits of the body, the season, the harvest, and the home. For a modern person, illness often begins with a name. A diagnosis, perhaps imperfect, still gives the suffering a category. In the medieval world, that certainty was much harder to reach. A cough might be a passing chill, the result of damp air, a sign of imbalance inside the body, a warning of something infectious, or a burden sent by God. The same outward symptom could sit inside several different explanations at once. That ambiguity mattered because treatment depended not only on what hurt, but on what people believed was happening beneath the surface. And beneath the surface, one of the most influential frameworks was the theory of the humors. Medieval medicine, especially learned medicine, inherited a great deal from Greek and Roman writers, particularly Galen and Hippocrates, as later interpreted through centuries of commentary. The human body, in this view, depended on a balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were linked to qualities like hot, cold, wet, and dry, and also to age, season, temperament, and diet. So illness was often understood not as the arrival of a single invading thing, but as an imbalance in the body's internal order. That sounds remote to modern ears, but it had a certain kind of logic. Medieval people lived close to visible processes of change. Food spoiled, weather shifted, bodies aged, moods changed with fatigue, hunger, grief, and heat. The world itself seemed structured by balance and disturbance. So it was not irrational, from within that setting, to imagine that health might depend on keeping the body in proper proportion. A person who seemed feverish, flushed, restless, and overheated might be thought too hot. A sluggish, congested, pale, or swollen patient might be seen differently. Treatment, then, was often an attempt to restore equilibrium. But here the first uncomfortable truth begins to appear. Without modern microbiology, without antibiotics, without imaging, without anesthesia in any reliable sense, and without the kind of standardized clinical testing modern people take for granted, even intelligent observation ran into hard limits. A medieval practitioner might notice color, pulse, temperature, urine, stool, appetite, sleep, speech, swelling, and pain. They might ask what the patient had eaten, what season it was, whether the illness came suddenly or gradually, whether there had been grief or strain, whether others nearby were also ill. None of that was foolish. In fact, some of it was attentive and careful. But attention is not the same as effective cure. And for many illnesses, the most painful fact was that people could describe suffering more clearly than they could change its outcome. That gap between explanation and recovery shaped the emotional reality of sickness. To be ill in the Middle Ages was often to wait. Not just to rest, but to wait inside uncertainty. A household might try warm broths, herbal preparations, poultices, plasters, bleeding, prayer, fasting, modified diet, or the advice of a local healer. Family members would watch for changes day by day, sometimes hour by hour, looking for signs that mattered. Whether the sweating had broken, whether the patient could keep food down, whether the stool looked unusual, whether the breathing became shallow, whether sleep came at all. Improvement could be interpreted as proof that the treatment was working. Decline could suggest that the body was overwhelmed, the imbalance too deep, the timing unfortunate, or that the wrong remedy had been chosen. And timing mattered more than we might expect. Medieval medicine paid close attention to regimen, which meant the ordering of daily life. Food, drink, sleep, movement, bathing, sexual activity, air, and emotional states. Health was not seen only as something repaired after collapse. It was something managed through habit. When people became sick, treatment often included not just a substance or procedure, but an entire adjustment of living conditions. Certain foods might be forbidden, others encouraged. The room might be aired or deliberately kept warm. Wine could be diluted, avoided, or prescribed depending on the case and the advisor. Rest itself became complicated because too much stillness could be seen as harmful in some conditions, while exertion in others might be disastrous. This is one of the reasons the medieval sickroom was not simply a place of passive misery. It was also a place of interpretation. Relatives, neighbors, clergy, and healers all brought frameworks with them. Illness sat at the meeting point of body, household, community, and soul. If a person remained sick for a long time, the question was not only what had gone wrong in the flesh, but what the illness meant. Was it a trial to endure? A punishment? A purification? A natural event? A danger to others? A sign that old age had finally turned a corner from weakness into final decline? For the poor, all of this became harsher still. Wealth did not guarantee safety, but poverty narrowed options immediately. A comfortable modern fantasy sometimes imagines that illness was at least met by communal care. And sometimes it was. Medieval life could be deeply collective. Kin, neighbors, and religious institutions mattered. But care required resources even when given freely. Someone had to fetch water, prepare broth, wash cloths, sit through the night, clean vomit, empty waste, and miss work. In a world where many families lived close to subsistence, prolonged sickness could threaten not only the body of the patient but the fragile economy of the entire household. If the sick person was a laborer, a servant, or a woman whose domestic work held daily life together, their illness rippled outward at once. Bread still had to be baked. Animals still had to be fed. Fuel still had to be gathered. Children still needed tending. So recovery was rarely just about bodily healing. It was also about whether the rhythms of ordinary life could survive the interruption. This is one reason many people likely endured significant illness while continuing to work far longer than was wise. Rest was valuable, but rest was also expensive. And then there was pain itself. Medieval people were not strangers to pain. They knew it intimately. Toothache, infected wounds, swollen joints, childbirth injury, fevers, skin eruptions, stomach disorders, parasites, and chronic weakness formed part of ordinary existence to a degree that modern listeners can easily underestimate. Yet familiarity does not equal tolerance in the simple sense. It is tempting to say that people in the past were somehow tougher, but that can flatten the truth. They were more accustomed to living in closer contact with discomfort, yes, but pain still frightened them, exhausted them, interrupted sleep, altered mood, and narrowed hope. A body in distress is still a body in distress, whether it lies in a modern clinic or on a straw mattress in a timber house. The setting of illness mattered too. Most people were not recovering in clean, quiet, temperature-controlled rooms. They were sick in homes that could be smoky, cold, crowded, damp, or shared with animals nearby. In winter, warmth was difficult to maintain evenly. In summer, rot and smell became harder to escape. Bedding could be infested. Water quality varied. Privacy was limited. Even basic comfort was unstable. So the experience of being ill was not only internal. The room itself could worsen suffering. A coughing patient in stale air, a feverish body under heavy blankets, a child with stomach illness in a household with poor sanitation, an older person weakened by repeated winter infections in a drafty structure. These were not unusual edge cases. They were part of the texture of ordinary vulnerability. And still, medieval people did not face illness empty-handed. Herbs were widely used and not always without effect. Honey, for instance, had practical value in some contexts. Certain plants could soothe digestion, induce sleep, ease pain, or act as mild antiseptics, even if their use was inconsistent or mixed with symbolic belief. Monastic communities sometimes preserved medical texts and cultivated herb gardens. Local knowledge passed through generations, especially among women who managed childbirth, childcare, food preparation, and domestic care. This is worth pausing on, because the common picture of medieval medicine as nothing but nonsense misses something important. It was a world of partial knowledge, not pure ignorance. The tragedy was that partial knowledge can comfort, sometimes even help, but it cannot reliably master serious disease. That is where the emotional contradiction grows deeper. Medieval people often did have treatments. What they often lacked was dependable treatment. A remedy might help one patient and fail another. It might ease symptoms without touching the cause. It might work because the illness was already passing. Or it might do harm while being administered with complete sincerity. Bloodletting is the most famous example. It has become almost a symbol of pre-modern medicine, and for good reason. To medieval practitioners operating within humoral theory, removing blood could seem like a rational way to reduce excess, fever, or pressure. But from a modern perspective, one can see how a weakened patient, already struggling, might be made even more vulnerable. Yet even here the story is more layered than easy ridicule allows. Bloodletting was not applied to every illness in the same way, nor was every practitioner equally aggressive or careless. Medical practice varied by region, education, wealth, and circumstance. Still, the larger truth remains. The body was often treated through methods that were guided by a coherent theory, but not by the sort of experimental evidence that would later transform medicine. That meant a sick person could be surrounded by concern, attention, and procedure, and still move steadily toward death. And death was never far from the medieval imagination. Not because people were morbid in some theatrical sense, but because mortality was visible. Children died. Women died in childbirth. Men died from injuries that became infected. Epidemics swept through communities. Winter could weaken the old. A minor wound could become dangerous. So when illness entered the house, it often brought with it a question that needed no dramatic statement. Is this survivable, or is this the beginning of the end? That question gave sickness a spiritual dimension that modern listeners may find hard to inhabit fully. Confession, last rites, prayer, pilgrimage vows, saints' shrines, relics, and intercessory devotion all formed part of the landscape of healing. For some, these were hopes for miracle. For others, they were ways of placing suffering inside a meaningful order. If medicine could not guarantee recovery, then salvation, preparation, and endurance became part of the response. A patient might seek not only relief from pain, but reconciliation with God. Family members, too, had to read the signs. When does one call for stronger remedies, and when does one call for a priest? That threshold could be agonizing, and it tells us something important about medieval sickness. It was rarely only medical. It was existential. To be sick was to be reminded that the body was fragile, that daily life rested on uncertain foundations, and that the line between inconvenience and catastrophe could be frighteningly thin. A cough was not always just a cough. A fever was not always temporary, and the people around the bed knew that, which means that the real experience of illness was not defined only by strange treatments or outdated theory. It was defined by the way sickness exposed the structure of medieval life itself, its poverty, its piety, its practical intelligence, its limitations, and its closeness to loss. And once that becomes clear, another question begins to open. If ordinary illness was already so difficult to interpret and endure, what happened when disease became visible on the skin, when the body changed shape, when communities began to fear not just suffering but contagion, stigma, and what one sick person might mean for everyone else around them? When illness became visible in that way, it changed everything. A fever hidden beneath blankets could remain a private worry inside one household, but a disease that marked the face, altered the skin, produced a smell, or visibly weakened the body could quickly become a public event. In medieval life, where communities were close, streets were narrow, and privacy was limited, the body itself often became an announcement. This was especially true with diseases like leprosy, though even that word requires caution. Medieval people used terms that do not always map neatly onto modern medical definitions. What they called leprosy could include several different skin conditions and chronic illnesses, not all of them what modern medicine would classify as Hansen's disease. But what mattered socially was not only the precise diagnosis. It was the visible fear surrounding it. Skin carried moral weight in medieval culture. The body was not simply flesh. It was also read symbolically. A face marked by disease could be interpreted medically, socially, and spiritually at once. Chronic visible illness could invite pity, suspicion, avoidance, and theological reflection, all in the same moment. People feared suffering, but they also feared what suffering appeared to say. Leprosy, in particular, sat at this difficult intersection. It was associated with slow bodily change, visible deterioration, and social separation. Medieval communities often established leper houses, sometimes outside town walls, sometimes near roads, sometimes supported by charity and religious obligation. These places were not always prisons in the dramatic sense people imagine, but they represented a powerful truth. Some forms of illness altered not just health, but belonging. To be sent away from ordinary domestic life was not simply a medical event. It was a rearrangement of identity. A person could still be alive, still thinking, still praying, still aware of their family, and yet no longer fully part of ordinary village rhythms. In some places, rituals surrounding exclusion could be almost symbolic of social death. The details varied widely, and historians are careful not to turn every case into theatrical exile, but the emotional reality remains sharp. Illness could isolate before it killed, and isolation itself carried danger. Separation from household life meant separation from familiar care. It meant new dependence, uncertainty, and often a long future measured less by cure than by management. Medieval people understood this with painful clarity. Some diseases were feared not because they killed quickly, but because they lingered. There was also the matter of reputation. A visible illness could affect marriage prospects, inheritance expectations, work opportunities, and social trust. In a world built heavily on face-to-face relationships, bodily appearance shaped economic life. If a craftsperson seemed weakened, if a servant appeared chronically ill, if a woman's illness raised whispered questions about fertility or contamination, practical consequences followed. Disease was never only biological. It moved through the social structure like weather through a weak roof. And then, of course, there were epidemics, the moments when illness stopped being an individual misfortune and became a collective event. Medieval Europe experienced many waves of epidemic disease, but none cast a longer shadow in cultural memory than plague. Before the Black Death of the 14th century, people already knew epidemic fear. Communities had seen sudden fevers, unexplained deaths, local outbreaks, and patterns they could not fully control. But the scale of plague transformed the emotional landscape of sickness. It was one thing to fear that one family member might not survive the winter. It was another to watch entire streets change in a season. When plague arrived, the old rhythms of explanation were strained to their limits. Traditional medicine still operated. Physicians observed symptoms, proposed causes, recommended treatments, but the speed and scale of mortality challenged confidence. Learned medical texts discussed corrupted air, planetary alignments, environmental disturbance, divine judgment, and bodily vulnerability. None of these explanations were simple superstition from within their own intellectual world. They were attempts to make sense of catastrophe using the tools available. Miasma, the idea of poisoned or corrupted air, became especially important. It made practical sense in a world where foul smells often did accompany decay and disease. Rotting waste, stagnant water, crowded streets, and the smell of death itself were real sensory experiences. If sickness seemed to travel invisibly yet was often associated with bad air and filth, the theory had a persuasive logic. People burned herbs, carried scented objects, cleaned streets when possible, and tried to manage the invisible through the senses. At the same time, plague pushed spiritual interpretation to the forefront. If ordinary illness already raised moral and religious questions, mass death made them impossible to ignore. Sermons, penitential processions, acts of charity, fear of judgment, and desperate prayer all intensified. Some people sought saints' shrines. Others turned to confession with new urgency. The boundary between public health and spiritual crisis was thin because the two were not understood as separate categories in the way modern people often separate them. But plague also revealed something harsher. Social order itself could become unstable when too many people were sick at once. Care depends on the healthy. What happens when caregivers are also exhausted, frightened, or dying? Hospitals, monasteries, families, and local institutions all faced limits. Labor shortages emerged. Food systems strained. Burial practices changed under pressure. The comforting fiction that every death would be attended properly became difficult to maintain. This is one of the most haunting parts of medieval sickness. People valued ritual around death deeply. A good death mattered. It involved preparation, confession, witnesses, prayer, and the presence of community. But epidemic disease could interrupt even that. Death could come too quickly or in too many numbers at once. Fear of contagion complicated intimacy. The sick might still long for familiar voices, but those voices were now negotiating terror of their own. And yet, even here, human behavior resisted simple stories. Some fled cities. Some stayed. Some abandoned obligations. Others took extraordinary risks to care for relatives, neighbors, and strangers. Clergy continued ministering. Women continued nursing. Household members sat beside beds they knew might infect them. Charity and fear lived side by side. That tension matters because modern storytelling often turns plague into either horror spectacle or statistical abstraction. But for medieval people, it was still lived through ordinary acts. Carrying water, changing cloths, trying to convince a child to eat, listening for breathing in the dark, deciding whether to sleep beside someone burning with fever. History becomes real again at that scale. And not every feared disease came with the dramatic violence of plague. Some of the most exhausting illnesses were chronic rather than explosive. Tuberculosis, though understood differently, shaped long-term weakness. Recurring digestive illness, parasites, untreated injuries, and infections that never fully resolved could turn life into a negotiation with partial strength. Medieval sickness was often not a single dramatic event, but a long erosion. A badly healed leg could alter decades of labor. Repeated fevers could leave permanent weakness. A dental infection could become an ongoing misery. We tend to remember historical medicine through dramatic surgeries and famous epidemics, but much of daily suffering was quieter than that. It lived in limps, in missing teeth, in winter coughs that never truly disappeared, in eyes that slowly failed, in joints that stiffened long before old age should have claimed them. For women, illness often intersected with childbirth in ways both ordinary and dangerous. Pregnancy was not treated as an illness, but it existed beside illness constantly. Childbirth could be routine, painful, traumatic, or fatal, and often all of these possibilities sat frighteningly close together. Midwives carried practical knowledge, and women relied heavily on female networks of care, but maternal mortality remained a real and familiar threat. A woman who survived one difficult birth might face another, and another after that. Recovery was uncertain. Infection, hemorrhage, retained placenta, and long-term bodily injury could reshape the rest of a life. And because reproduction was tied so closely to household continuity, a woman's sickness in this area was never treated as merely private. Touched inheritance, marriage, labor, and family survival. Children, too, lived in constant proximity to illness. Medieval parents loved their children deeply, but they also lived with the knowledge that not all of them would survive. Infant mortality was not an abstract demographic fact. It was a repeated household grief. Fevers, diarrhea, respiratory illness, malnutrition, and seasonal disease could turn childhood precarious. Remedies existed, but certainty did not. This created a different emotional relationship to hope. People did not love less because loss was common. If anything, the opposite may be true. The fragility of childhood sharpened attachment. A sick child in a medieval house was not merely a medical concern. It was a confrontation with helplessness that every parent could understand. And through all of this, hospitals existed, but not as modern listeners imagine them. Medieval hospitals were often places of hospitality, charity, and spiritual care as much as clinical treatment. Some served the poor, travelers, pilgrims, the elderly, and the chronically ill rather than functioning primarily as surgical centers. Care and salvation were intertwined. Rest, food, prayer, and shelter could be as important as intervention. This can surprise modern viewers who imagine the hospital primarily as a machine for cure. Medieval hospitals often aimed first at mercy. They could not guarantee recovery, but they could offer dignity, community, and order to people whose illness had made ordinary life unstable. In that sense, they reveal something important about the age. When cure was uncertain, care itself became morally central. Still, one should not romanticize them. Conditions varied enormously. Resources were limited. Hygiene by modern standards was inconsistent. Outcomes could be grim. But they remind us that people in the Middle Ages were not indifferent to suffering. They were surrounded by it, and they built institutions, imperfect ones, to respond. Perhaps the strangest thing for a modern person to grasp is that medieval people often lived without the expectation that every illness should be fixable. This did not mean resignation in the lazy sense. People fought for life, sought remedies, prayed, paid physicians, trusted healers, and hoped fiercely. But they also inhabited a world where uncertainty was normal, not exceptional. That changes the emotional shape of sickness. Modern medicine, for all its failures, often begins with the promise that intervention should be possible. Medieval life began more often with the question of endurance. Can this be survived? Can the household absorb it? Can the body recover enough to work? Can the soul be prepared if it does not? And perhaps that is why illness reveals medieval life so clearly. It strips away romance. It shows not castles or kings first, but beds, bowls, herbs, prayers, fear, and long nights of listening for signs of dawn. It shows how people loved under pressure, how communities decided who to care for, and how fragile ordinary survival really was. But even within that fragile world, one group stood at a particularly uneasy boundary between hope and suspicion, the people who claimed, or were believed, to know how to heal outside the formal structures of learned medicine. Not university physicians, not monastery infirmarians, but local healers, cunning women, herbal specialists, bone setters, and those whose knowledge lived in reputation rather than in Latin texts. And once illness entered their hands, the line between medicine and accusation could become dangerously thin. That danger came from a simple reality. When formal medicine could not guarantee relief, people looked wherever relief might still be found. Illness creates urgency, and urgency rarely respects neat professional boundaries. A mother with a feverish child, a farmer unable to walk after a fall, an older man with a wound that would not close. None of them were primarily interested in intellectual debates about legitimate authority. They wanted help. They wanted the pain to stop. They wanted the person they loved to survive the week. So alongside physicians trained in universities and surgeons working with knives, cautery, and practical bodily repair, there existed a wide landscape of local healers. Some were midwives, some were herbalists, some specialized in bones, teeth, childbirth, burns, or animal bites. Some carried prayers, charms, and spoken remedies alongside plants and poultices. Some were respected for generations. Others were distrusted but visited anyway. This was not necessarily a separate underground world. It was often the ordinary medical world most people actually knew. University physicians were expensive, urban, and often distant from rural life. For much of the population, the first response to illness came from family knowledge and local reputation. A neighbor knew which plant soothed swelling. An older woman knew how to turn a difficult labor. A village bone setter knew how to bind a broken wrist better than anyone else nearby. These people mattered because they were present, and presence in sickness can be more powerful than prestige. Many women occupied central positions in this practical medicine, especially around childbirth, infant care, and household remedies. Medieval domestic life made them custodians of everyday bodily knowledge. They observed patterns across generations. Which foods worsened stomach illness, which herbs calmed sleeplessness, how long a fever should be watched before panic set in, what signs in pregnancy meant danger rather than discomfort. This was knowledge built through repetition, not theory. Modern people sometimes imagine medieval medicine divided neatly between real doctors and superstition. But lived reality was much messier. A respected healer might use herbs, prayer, observation, and inherited ritual together without seeing contradiction. The patient might accept all of it without concern for philosophical consistency. If the swelling went down, if the child slept, if the pain eased, that mattered more than abstract categories. Yet this same flexibility created anxiety. The line between healing and forbidden practice could become alarmingly unstable, especially when treatment involved spoken charms, protective objects, astrological timing, or anything that looked too close to hidden power. Medieval Christianity did not reject healing itself, far from it, but it was deeply concerned with the source of power. Was a cure the result of God's grace, natural properties placed in creation, legitimate skill, or something darker? That question was rarely simple in practice. A healer who whispered prayers over an herb mixture might be seen by one person as pious and by another as suspicious. A charm invoking saints could be accepted in one place and condemned in another. A successful cure might create gratitude, but repeated success could also create unease. People admired what worked, yet they feared what they could not explain. And fear becomes sharper when illness itself feels morally loaded. If disease already raised questions about sin, judgment, and hidden causes, then someone who seemed unusually effective at controlling illness could attract both trust and suspicion. Healing power was never socially neutral. This tension became especially visible during periods of wider anxiety. Bad harvests, outbreaks of disease, unusual deaths, infant mortality, or unexplained livestock losses. In moments when suffering spread without clear explanation, communities looked for patterns. Someone had to make sense of it. Sometimes that meant turning toward local healers for protection. Sometimes it meant turning against them. It is important not to collapse all of this into the later witch trials too quickly, because the medieval world was not one single undifferentiated fear. But the seeds were there. Anxiety about hidden causes, unease around women's authority in intimate bodily spaces, suspicion of knowledge outside official structures, and the terrifying human habit of looking for a person to blame when randomness becomes unbearable. A child dies unexpectedly. Cow sickens. A woman survives childbirth while another does not. One household recovers from fever while another loses 3 people in a month. Patterns appear because the mind needs them to, and once suspicion enters a village, ordinary memory can be rewritten. The helpful woman with herbs becomes the strange woman who always knew too much. The midwife becomes the person who was present when things went wrong. This is one of the cruelest truths of sickness in any age. The same desperation that creates trust can also create accusation. Even licensed practitioners were not immune from failure of reputation. Medieval physicians carried social authority, but also risk. If a wealthy patient died after expensive treatment, disappointment could become scandal. Medical advice was visible. A physician might prescribe bleeding, dietary change, costly ingredients, or extended care, and when the body failed anyway, blame followed easily. Authority offered prestige, but it also made failure public. This is partly why medicine and humility were forced into such close contact. Even the most learned practitioner had to live with the fact that the body did not always obey explanation. A physician could read Galen, examine urine carefully, and still stand helplessly beside a patient whose fever rose without mercy. In that sense, medieval medicine demanded a strange mixture of confidence and acceptance. One had to act, but also admit that outcomes were not fully controllable. Urine itself, strangely enough, became one of the most recognizable symbols of this world. Uroscopy, the examination of urine, was central to diagnosis. Physicians studied its color, smell, clarity, sediment, and consistency, often using a glass flask called a metulla. To modern eyes, it can seem oddly narrow, even comic, but within the logic of the time it offered something precious: visible evidence from inside the body. If the hidden interior could not be opened safely, it had to be interpreted through what emerged from it. Urine was accessible, observable, and linked to theories of humoral balance. It could suggest heat, coldness, weakness, obstruction, or corruption. Patients brought samples. Doctors compared shades. Illustrations in manuscripts classified colors with surprising seriousness. And again, what matters is not whether modern medicine would approve, but why this practice felt convincing. It offered structure. It turned invisible suffering into something that could be examined. It made the physician seem less like a guesser and more like an interpreter of signs. In a world of uncertainty, signs mattered enormously. The same logic shaped bloodletting calendars and astrological timing. Certain treatments were believed to be safer or more effective depending on the season, the moon, or the patient's constitution. Modern listeners may instinctively dismiss this, but we should notice the deeper instinct beneath it: the desire to place illness within a larger order. If the body was connected to the cosmos, then timing mattered. Health was not separate from the world. It was part of it. This worldview also meant that mental and emotional states were not isolated from physical illness. Grief, fear, anger, and melancholy were taken seriously as bodily realities. A person wasting away after bereavement was not merely being poetic. Emotional suffering was expected to affect appetite, sleep, digestion, and strength. In some ways, this was remarkably perceptive. The categories were different, but the recognition that sorrow lives in the body was very real. Melancholy especially occupied a complicated place. Linked to black bile in humoral theory, it could describe sadness, fear, heaviness of spirit, withdrawal, and certain forms of mental disturbance. Treatment might involve music, conversation, prayer, improved diet, changes of air or company. Not because medieval people had modern psychiatry, but because they recognized that despair could behave like illness and that isolation could deepen it. This reminds us that being sick in the Middle Ages was not always visible from the outside. Some suffering lived quietly behind ordinary faces. Sleeplessness, grief, anxiety, religious fear, exhaustion after repeated childbirth, and the mental burden of poverty all shaped health even when no wound could be pointed to. The body and soul were understood as deeply entangled because, in lived experience, they were. And nowhere was that entanglement more obvious than in monasteries and convents, where spiritual discipline and bodily weakness often met each other every day. Religious communities were places of prayer, but also of aging, chronic illness, injury, and death. Monastic infirmaries served not only as medical spaces but as reminders that even disciplined spiritual life did not protect anyone from the ordinary humiliations of the body. A monk with gout still limped. A nun with recurring fevers still missed prayer. Fasting could weaken. Cold stone buildings could worsen winter illness. Copying manuscripts strained the eyes and back. Silence did not remove pain. It sometimes made it louder. Yet these spaces also preserved medical texts, organized care, and offered continuity. The sick could be attended without the immediate economic panic of a peasant household losing labor. That difference mattered. Wealth and institution did not eliminate suffering, but they changed its surroundings. A noble with chronic illness might have servants, better food, private chambers, and access to physicians unavailable to common people. A peasant might have smoke, shared bedding, and a neighbor's advice. The disease itself might be the same. The experience was not. Even kings could not escape this truth. Royal illness often revealed how fragile power really was. A ruler with recurring weakness, sudden fever, or visible decline turned private sickness into political crisis. Courts watched the body of the king as carefully as any physician. Succession, war, taxation, marriage alliances all could shift because one body failed. The famous grandeur of medieval rulership becomes much less glamorous when viewed through the sickroom. Curtains drawn against drafts, whispered consultations, fear of poisoning, prayers at bedside, attendants reading symptoms like omens. Power narrowed quickly when reduced to a sweating human body unable to rise from bed. And for ordinary people watching from below, these moments reinforced something universal. Sickness ignored rank. Wealth could buy time, attention, and comfort, but not immunity. Death still entered castles. Children still died in noble households. Queens still faced childbirth with danger. Physicians still failed. Perhaps that is why saints associated with healing became so important. People wanted intermediaries not because they rejected practical treatment, but because practical treatment had visible limits. Pilgrimage to healing shrines was not irrational escape from medicine. It was often medicine extended into the sacred. If the body could not be repaired by ordinary means, perhaps grace could reach where knives and herbs could not. Some pilgrims reported remarkable cures. Others found only temporary hope. But the journey itself mattered. It transformed passive suffering into action. It gave illness a road, a destination, a structure of prayer and expectation. In a life shaped by uncertainty, movement toward hope had its own kind of medicine. And still, beneath all of this, physicians, herbs, prayers, shrines, suspicion, diagnosis, charity, there remained the most ordinary and often most difficult part of sickness, the simple endurance of time, the long afternoon of fever, the night that would not pass, the repeated question of whether the pain was less or simply familiar, the moment a family member touched a forehead and could not decide whether it felt cooler or whether they only wanted it to. That waiting defined medieval illness as much as any treatment. Because before recovery, before death, before certainty of any kind, there was often just the room itself. Dim light, the smell of broth, damp cloths, whispered voices, the sound of church bells outside marking hours that felt both slow and frighteningly fast. And somewhere in that room sat another truth people rarely imagine when they picture the Middle Ages. Not the drama of plague or surgery, but the quiet terror of wondering whether morning would arrive with improvement, or with someone sent to summon the priest. And that decision, whether it was finally time to summon the priest, was one of the most emotionally charged moments in medieval illness. It meant that uncertainty was beginning to narrow. The household was no longer asking only how to restore the body, but whether the soul needed preparation for departure. This was not necessarily a surrender. Priests were called for many serious illnesses from which people later recovered. But everyone in the room understood the weight of the gesture. Confession, absolution, last rites, and the Eucharist were not simply religious formalities. They were part of what medieval people considered a good death. Not painless, not peaceful in the sentimental modern sense, but ordered, witnessed, and spiritually prepared. To die suddenly, without confession, without the chance to set one's affairs in order, without prayer or reconciliation, was frightening in ways that reached beyond physical pain. Illness, however terrible, at least offered the possibility of preparation. A fever that lingered for days could allow conversations that a cart accident or sudden stroke did not. Debts could be named. Apologies could be spoken. Wills could be arranged. Children could be blessed. Land could be discussed. Promises could be made. This gave the sickbed a strange dual character. It was a place of suffering, but also of social clarity. Illness forced truths into the open. Family tensions that had been ignored for years might suddenly matter. Questions of inheritance became immediate. Hidden resentments softened or sharpened. A person who had always seemed strong might now depend entirely on the daughter who had quietly done most of the household labor all along. In that sense, sickness revealed social reality more honestly than health did. And the rituals around dying reflected this. Witnesses mattered. Memory mattered. Reputation mattered. A dying person was not leaving only a body behind, but a place in the moral memory of the community. Medieval society was built heavily on continuity. Family names, obligations, prayers for the dead, remembered promises. To die well was partly to leave order rather than confusion. That did not mean death was calm. Fear remained powerful. Pain remained real. Some illnesses brought delirium, breathlessness, panic, or physical decline so exhausting that spiritual ideals became difficult to inhabit. A person gasping through pneumonia was not living inside a polished theological painting. They were struggling to breathe. Yet even then, people around them tried to create meaning where the body created chaos. This is where we must resist the temptation to imagine medieval people as either stoically accepting death or theatrically obsessed with it. They were neither. They were people who knew death intimately because they had fewer illusions of distance from it. That intimacy could produce practical acceptance, yes, but also terror, bargaining, denial, tenderness, and anger, the same human responses that appear in any century. Children seeing parents die, husbands losing wives in childbirth, women burying infants, brothers nursing brothers through winter fevers. None of this was emotionally lighter because it was familiar. Repetition does not remove grief. It only changes the shape of it. And grief itself had medical consequences. Mourning could weaken appetite, disturb sleep, and deepen illness. A widow already undernourished could decline quickly after loss. An elderly parent might survive physically but seem to lose the desire to continue. Medieval medicine, for all its limitations, often recognized this link instinctively. Sorrow was not treated as separate from bodily health because daily life made that separation impossible to believe. There was also a quieter category of illness that rarely receives dramatic attention: aging. Modern conversations about medieval health often focus on plague or surgery because they are vivid. But many people did not die in dramatic epidemics. They simply wore down. Teeth failed, eyes dimmed, hearing weakened, joints stiffened, digestion changed, strength declined. A fall that would once have been minor became life-altering. Winter became harder each year. Old age in the Middle Ages was shaped not just by years lived, but by the accumulated cost of labor. A peasant who had spent decades carrying water, cutting wood, lifting grain, and enduring cold did not arrive at 60 with the same body as a sheltered noble. Bones remembered work. Hands remembered winters. Illness in later life was often the body presenting a long record of survival. And survival itself could be complicated. To live long enough to become visibly old was, in some contexts, a kind of achievement. But it also meant increasing dependence in a world without modern retirement structures. Older people often relied on family, religious charity, or community obligation. If those supports were weak, illness became entangled with fear of becoming a burden. This fear was not abstract. Who would feed you if you could no longer work? Who would clean you if illness made you helpless? Who would advocate for you if memory faded or pain made speech difficult? Medieval sickness was social because vulnerability was social. Hospitals and almshouses sometimes offered partial answers, especially in towns, but access varied and resources were limited. Charity existed, but charity also depended on local priorities, wealth, and moral judgment. Some people were considered deserving, others were not. Illness could expose not only compassion but hierarchy. And hierarchy shaped treatment in subtler ways too. Pain itself was interpreted differently depending on status. A noble complaining of discomfort might receive immediate attention. A laborer expected to endure the same pain might simply be told to continue. Bodies were political, whose suffering counted, whose recovery was worth investment, whose weakness could be tolerated. These were never neutral decisions. Women often faced a particularly difficult version of this problem. Their pain, especially around menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery, could be treated as both ordinary and therefore easy to dismiss. Something expected could become invisible. If childbirth was common, its dangers could be normalized even while remaining deadly. A woman's exhaustion after repeated pregnancies might be interpreted less as illness than as duty. This is one reason domestic medicine remained so important. Women often relied on each other not because formal medicine was absent, but because much of their suffering lived inside spaces men did not fully control or understand. Female networks carried practical knowledge, emotional care, and survival strategies that formal records only partly preserve. Yet even male chroniclers, physicians, and religious writers leave traces of how physically demanding ordinary life was. Illness was not always a break from normal existence. Sometimes normal existence itself produced illness. Bad teeth from rough bread and poor nutrition. Infections from constant minor injuries. Respiratory problems from smoke-filled interiors. Skin diseases worsened by labor, dampness, and limited washing conditions. The line between daily life and sickness was often very thin. This may be the deepest misunderstanding modern viewers bring to the Middle Ages. The idea that health and illness were separate states, neatly divided. In reality, many people lived in a long middle ground, never fully well, never fully incapacitated, managing recurring discomfort while still working, parenting, praying, and surviving. A chronic bad back was not a diagnosis. It was just life. Persistent stomach pain, intermittent fevers, recurring headaches, exhaustion after childbirth, poorly healed injuries. These might never be solved. They were endured, adapted to, explained through available language, and folded into identity. That endurance shaped personality and community. It made patience a practical virtue rather than a decorative one. It also made small reliefs matter enormously. A warm room in winter, a neighbor bringing broth, a pain easing enough to sleep, a fever breaking by morning. Health was not always measured by complete cure, but by the return of ordinary function. The ability to rise, to walk, to eat, to work, to laugh once at the table again. And because ordinary function mattered so much, surgery, however limited, carried a strange combination of hope and horror. Medieval surgery was not the refined operating room modern people imagine. It was practical, often brutal, and shaped by the terrifying absence of reliable anesthesia or infection control. Surgeons dealt with wounds, fractures, abscesses, cataracts, amputations, stones, and injuries that could not simply be prayed away. They occupied an uneasy place in the medical hierarchy. Learned physicians often held higher intellectual prestige, while surgeons worked with hands, blood, and visible damage. Yet for a person with an arrow wound, a shattered limb, or a swollen abscess threatening death, practical skill mattered more than scholarly status. There was courage here on both sides. Patients submitted to procedures they knew would hurt terribly because the alternative might be worse. Surgeons cut knowing that even success could be followed by infection, fever, and death. There was no illusion of comfort. Consent, if we can call it that, often came from necessity. Tooth extraction alone could be an event people dreaded for years. A bad tooth could poison appetite, sleep, and thought itself. Pulling it might be agony, but leaving it might be worse. Medieval illness often involved choosing between two forms of suffering rather than between suffering and relief. This pattern repeated everywhere. Bleeding might weaken but was believed to prevent something worse. Cauterizing a wound was painful but could stop deadly infection. Restrictive diets felt harsh but were attempts to restore balance. Much of medicine was built around tolerating immediate discomfort for uncertain future survival. That uncertainty is what makes the history feel so intimate. Modern medicine has not removed fear, but it has changed its texture. Medieval people often had to act without much promise that the action would work. Hope was real, but it was rarely guaranteed by expertise alone. Perhaps that is why community remained such a powerful form of treatment. Not because affection cured disease, but because illness without companionship was a second kind of suffering. Someone to sit beside you, to turn cloths in cool water, to remember what the physician said, to argue over whether your fever felt lower, to stay awake while you slept badly. That was medicine too, even if no manuscript called it that. And in many households, the true center of care was not the physician who visited briefly, but the person who remained through the night. Usually that meant women. Mothers, wives, daughters, sisters, widows, servants, nuns. Much of the invisible labor of medieval sickness passed through their hands. They prepared food, managed bedding, cleaned bodies, soothed frightened children, handled childbirth, watched symptoms, and absorbed grief repeatedly. History often records kings and physicians, but recovery or death often depended first on the exhausted person still awake at midnight beside the bed. This labor was intimate, repetitive, and often uncelebrated. It was also dangerous. Caregivers exposed themselves to infection constantly. They lost sleep. They neglected their own bodies. During outbreaks, they sometimes died simply because love and duty required proximity. And this creates one final reversal worth holding on to. When we imagine medicine in the Middle Ages, we tend to picture the dramatic image first: the physician with the urine flask, the plague doctor, the surgeon with iron tools, the monastery infirmary. But the real center of sickness was usually smaller and quieter than that. It was a house, a bed near the fire if there was enough wood, a bowl cooling on the table, a candle burning lower than anyone intended because no one wanted the room dark yet, someone counting breaths, someone pretending not to be afraid, someone deciding as dawn approached whether this was the morning to send for the priest or the morning to send, instead, for one more healer whose name had been whispered by a neighbor, someone said to have helped before, someone living just beyond the fields, where medicine and mystery still sat very close together, that person. Living just beyond the fields, known by reputation more than by title, often represented the last hopeful turn before despair settled in. They might be called a wise woman, a cunning man, a healer, a bone setter, a charm worker, or simply someone who knew things. Their authority rarely came from books. It came from stories. They helped a child survive a winter fever. They set a broken arm after a cart accident. They eased a labor everyone feared would end badly. They knew which plants stopped the swelling when nothing else did. In a world where suffering was personal, reputation traveled faster than theory. These healers often stood in a complicated relationship with formal medicine. Sometimes physicians dismissed them. Sometimes physicians quietly borrowed from the same practical knowledge. Sometimes families moved between both worlds without seeing any contradiction at all. A person might consult a university-trained doctor, pray at a shrine, and then send for a village herbalist in the same week. To modern categories, this looks inconsistent. To medieval people, it often looked like common sense. You tried what might help. Herbal medicine was central to that world. Medieval people knew plants intimately because survival required it. They understood fields, gardens, woods, and seasons in practical ways. Willow, sage, mint, garlic, fennel, lavender, comfrey, nettle, chamomile. These and many others were not exotic curiosities but part of ordinary life. Some were used for digestion, some for wounds, some for sleep, some for childbirth, some for fever, some simply because generations had trusted them. Not every remedy worked. Some were symbolic, some ineffective, some actively dangerous. But again, it is too easy to laugh backward at history. Certain plant-based treatments did have real physiological effects, even if medieval people understood them through different language. Honey could help wounds. Garlic had practical value. Warm infusions could soothe. Rest, hydration, and nourishment hidden inside folk remedies sometimes did more than the more dramatic interventions of elite medicine. This is one of the quieter ironies of the period. The most trustworthy treatment might not be the most impressive one. A patient with stomach illness may have been helped less by elaborate theory than by someone who simply insisted on broth, warmth, and time. A wound may have survived because it was kept clean and left undisturbed rather than aggressively treated. Sometimes what looked like humble domestic care was the closest thing to effective medicine available. But uncertainty always hovered nearby, because illness does not politely announce which remedy matters and which one merely accompanies recovery. If a fever broke after an herb was given, was the plant responsible or had the illness simply turned on its own? If a child worsened after a charm was spoken, was the charm at fault, or was the disease already beyond help? Human beings dislike randomness, and medieval people were no different. This is where superstition, if we use the word carefully, enters the story. Protective amulets, written prayers, saint medals, blessed objects, charms spoken over water, rituals performed at thresholds or crossroads. These were not always seen as separate from medicine. They were ways of managing danger in a world where invisible causes felt everywhere. Disease could come from bad air, divine punishment, corrupted food, hidden imbalance, envy, misfortune, or forces not easily named. Protection, therefore, also had to be broad. A mother placing a blessed object near a sick child was not choosing magic over reason. She was acting inside a worldview where the body, the soul, and the unseen world were already connected. Protection was layered. One did not choose between prayer and treatment. One used both. And still, this closeness between healing and the unseen created risk. When remedies failed repeatedly, suspicion grew. If a healer was too successful, some people asked dangerous questions. If they failed too often, different dangerous questions followed. The same woman sought for childbirth might later be whispered about if too many infants died. The same herbalist praised for skill might become frightening if people believed her knowledge came from the wrong source. This tension deepened across the later medieval world and into the early modern period, where accusations of witchcraft would grow more formal and destructive. But even earlier, the emotional structure was already there. Fear of hidden harm, anxiety around unexplained suffering, and communities searching for someone to blame when pain refused explanation. It is worth remembering how thin the line between healer and suspect could be. Imagine a village where 3 children die in one winter. Food is scarce. Animals are sick. A woman known for remedies visits several homes. She cannot save everyone. Soon memory rearranges itself. People begin to remember her as strange. They notice what they had ignored. She lived alone. She knew too much about herbs. She muttered while working. She had once argued with someone whose cow later died. Illness creates stories because stories feel safer than chaos. This does not mean medieval people were uniquely irrational. Modern societies do the same thing with different language. We still search for villains when randomness feels intolerable. But in a world without reliable diagnostics, where disease often appeared suddenly and explanation remained partial, suspicion could become a kind of emotional medicine, dangerous but psychologically powerful. Even hospitals, those places built for care, could not fully escape this uncertainty. The medieval hospital was often less a site of aggressive intervention than a place of structured mercy. The Latin roots themselves point toward hospitality. Many hospitals sheltered the poor, elderly, travelers, pilgrims, and the chronically ill. Some were attached to religious institutions. Some focused on charity more than cure. They offered beds, food, prayer, washing, and order. For someone sick enough that ordinary household life had collapsed, this mattered enormously. To modern people, cure often feels like the obvious purpose of medicine. But when cure is uncertain, comfort becomes profound. Clean linen, warm food, a bed not shared with too many bodies, regular prayer, human attention. These were not small things. They could mean the difference between dying abandoned and dying accompanied. Some hospitals specialized more than others. Leper houses, for example, existed partly to manage long-term visible illness and partly to create social distance from feared disease. Other institutions cared for pilgrims and the poor, where sickness mixed with exhaustion, hunger, and age. The boundaries between medical, charitable, and spiritual care were much softer than modern institutions would allow. And yet hospitals also revealed social judgment. Charity was moral as well as practical. Some sufferers were seen as worthy recipients of care. Others were treated with suspicion. A respectable elderly widow, a pilgrim, a sick child. These inspired one kind of response. Someone associated with drunkenness, crime, or moral failure might inspire another. Illness was rarely judged in isolation from character. This moral reading of sickness could be deeply unfair, but it was powerful. If disease might reflect divine order, then suffering invited interpretation. Why had this person become ill? Was it simply nature? Was it punishment? Was it a test? Medieval people did not always answer these questions harshly. Many recognized the innocent suffering of children and good people, but the questions themselves shaped care. This also affected those with illnesses of the mind. Mental disturbance in the Middle Ages was interpreted through many overlapping lenses. Melancholy, spiritual crisis, demonic influence, grief, physical imbalance, or social stress. A person hearing voices, withdrawing from life, behaving unpredictably, or falling into deep despair might be treated medically, pastorally, or both. There was no single category equivalent to modern psychiatry. Some cases were probably handled with surprising gentleness. Rest, companionship, prayer, music, pilgrimage, dietary change. Others were treated with fear or coercion, especially if behavior threatened household order. Again, the key is complexity. Medieval people did not have our clinical language, but they knew that minds could suffer. A man broken by war, a mother lost in grief after repeated infant deaths, an elderly person confused by age, a monk trapped in crushing religious despair. These were recognizable realities. The explanations differed, but the human experience did not vanish. One particularly painful form of illness sat between body and spirit, what religious writers called despair or aestia. In monasteries especially, this could mean exhaustion of purpose, spiritual heaviness, inability to pray, restlessness, sadness, and a sense that life had become inwardly empty. Modern listeners might hear echoes of depression. Medieval writers heard danger to the soul. Treatment might involve confession, discipline, work, conversation, scripture, and community rather than isolation. And while the language was different, there is something quietly perceptive in recognizing that loneliness and hopelessness can become illnesses of their own. Because perhaps the most universal part of sickness, then as now, was loneliness. Pain isolates. Fever narrows the world. Chronic weakness makes ordinary conversation feel distant. A person lying awake at night with a failing body often enters a strange private country, even when surrounded by family. Medieval people knew this intimately. Their remedies, both practical and spiritual, were often attempts to cross that distance. Prayer crossed it. Shared meals crossed it. Vigil beside a bedside crossed it. Pilgrimage crossed it. Confession crossed it. The simple act of someone staying in the room crossed it. This is why the image of the solitary medieval patient is often misleading. Illness was crowded. Too crowded, sometimes. Privacy was rare. A person might be sick in a room where children still moved, where animals were near, where servants entered, where neighbors asked questions, where family listened to every cough. Solitude was emotional, not architectural. And there was another kind of fear that moved quietly beneath all of this. The fear of being remembered badly. If sickness lingered, people worried about becoming a burden. If death approached, they worried about debts, unresolved anger, damaged reputation, children left vulnerable. The sickbed was not only about pain, it was about legacy. What would remain after the body failed? Land, certainly. Objects, perhaps. But more than that, memory. Would prayers be said? Would promises be kept? Would children remember kindness or absence? Would a spouse be protected? Would neighbors speak well of you, or only of disputes left unresolved? This gave dying an almost administrative seriousness. Wills mattered. Witnesses mattered. Final words mattered. Medieval illness often forced emotional honesty because time no longer allowed postponement. And strangely, This could produce moments of great tenderness. Harsh fathers softened. Estranged brothers reconciled. Old arguments became suddenly small beside mortality. Not always, of course. Some people died angry, frightened, or bitter, but illness often stripped away the illusion that there would always be another season to fix things. Perhaps that is why so many accounts of sickness feel less like medical records and more like moral landscapes. The body failing was never just biology. It was a test of households, of love, of faith, of patience, of practical competence. It asked who stayed, who fled, who paid, who prayed, who forgave, and who could not. And nowhere did these questions become more visible than during childbirth, where pain, hope, fear, medicine, religion, and the possibility of death all entered the same room at once, often with astonishing speed, and with very little certainty about who would still be alive by morning. Childbirth was perhaps the most ordinary dangerous event in medieval life. It was expected, repeated, and woven into the structure of family survival, yet it sat frighteningly close to catastrophe. For many women, the moment that brought continuity to the household was also the moment most likely to end their own life. That contradiction shaped everything around it. Unlike sudden plague or an unexpected injury, childbirth arrived with anticipation. The household prepared for it. Women in the family watched signs, counted months, noticed swelling, fatigue, appetite, and the changing pace of daily work. Pregnancy was not invisible. It reorganized labor, expectation, and quiet anxiety. Everyone knew what was coming. No one could know how it would end. And this uncertainty mattered because medieval childbirth happened largely outside the authority of learned male physicians. Birth belonged first to women. Mothers, sisters, neighbors, servants, and above all, midwives. These were the people who entered the room when labor began, who understood the rhythms of pain, who knew when fear was ordinary and when it signaled real danger. The birthing room itself was a world apart. It was practical, intimate, and often closed to men. Heat mattered. Privacy mattered. Familiar female presence mattered. Bedding, cloths, warm water if available, stools, cushions, oils, herbs, prayers, and steady hands. All of these shaped the experience more than any formal medical theory. A midwife's authority came from repetition. She had seen births go quickly, births that lasted through the night, births that ended in silence, births that required strength no one expected. And perhaps most importantly, she knew how thin the line could be between one and the other. For modern listeners, it is easy to assume childbirth was simply accepted because it was common. But frequency does not reduce fear. If anything, it sharpens it. Women knew exactly what could happen because they had seen it happen. To sisters, mothers, neighbors, friends. A woman entering labor did not need statistics to understand risk. She had memory. Pain, of course, was expected. Medieval Christian thought often framed labor pain through the story of Eve, connecting childbirth to theological ideas of suffering and human fallenness. But lived experience was never just symbolic. Pain was immediate, physical, exhausting. Long labor meant fear. Silence in the room meant fear. Too much blood meant fear. A baby positioned badly could turn hope into panic with terrible speed. And here again we find that medieval people were not passive in the face of danger. Midwives used practical techniques, changing position, massage, warmth, encouraging movement, supporting posture, guiding breath, using oils or herbal preparations, attempting manual correction when possible. Some remedies were helpful, some limited, some dangerous. But there was skill here, not simple helplessness. Still, there were hard limits. Obstructed labor, severe bleeding, infection, retained placenta. These could become fatal in a world without surgical obstetrics, antibiotics, or blood transfusion. The body could simply reach a point where care turned into waiting and prayer. That waiting was unbearable. The household outside the birthing room often lived in suspended time. Men waited with little control. Children sensed tension. Neighbors listened for news. Hours stretched. And because infant baptism mattered deeply, another layer of urgency entered the room if the child seemed unlikely to survive. Emergency baptism could be performed quickly because the soul of the infant mattered as much as the survival of the mother. This is one of the hardest emotional realities to fully grasp. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was often a double threshold. Two lives were balanced together, and saving one did not guarantee saving the other. A family could welcome a child and lose a mother in the same morning. Joy and grief were not separate events. They could arrive holding the same name. This shaped marriage itself. Husbands loved wives while knowing pregnancy could take them. Women entered repeated pregnancies knowing each one carried real danger. Survival after one difficult birth did not erase the fear of the next. A woman might spend much of adult life moving through cycles of pregnancy, recovery, breastfeeding, and renewed risk. And recovery, even when successful, was often far from simple. Modern memory tends to focus only on whether mother and child survived. But survival was not the end of the story. Infection, weakness, tearing, chronic pain, pelvic injury, exhaustion, and repeated strain could alter the rest of a woman's life. Some injuries were permanent. Some suffering became ordinary because there was no language of cure available. This is another place where history grows quieter and more honest. Not every illness had a dramatic beginning. Sometimes it was the body never fully returning to itself after birth. Midwives stood at the center of all this, and with that came respect, but also vulnerability. Like other healers working close to uncertainty, they could be praised or blamed with frightening speed. A successful birth created gratitude. A dead child, a dying mother, or repeated losses in one family could invite suspicion. Midwives carried responsibility without control over outcome, which is often the most dangerous kind. And because birth involved blood, secrecy, sexuality, and life at its most vulnerable, midwives existed in a morally charged space. They were trusted with intimate knowledge and sometimes feared for the same reason. Later, witchcraft accusations would often fall heavily on women associated with birth and healing, but even earlier, the emotional structure was already present. The person closest to the mystery could become the person blamed for tragedy. There was also class inside childbirth, just as there was inside every other form of illness. A noblewoman might labor in a better heated chamber, with more attendants, better food, cleaner linen, and perhaps access to elite physicians if complications arose. A peasant woman might labor in a smoky, crowded house while household work still pressed at the edges of the room. But rank did not remove danger. Queens died in childbirth too. Noble blood did not persuade infection to be merciful. In fact, the stakes of elite childbirth could become political as well as personal. The birth of an heir was not simply a family event. Dynasties depended on it. Kingdoms watched royal pregnancies with the same anxious attention a village gave to a neighbor's labor, only with far greater consequences. If a queen died, grief and succession could collide. If an heir died, the future itself seemed to wobble. This reveals something essential about medieval sickness more broadly. The body was never only private. Illness moved through economics, inheritance, religion, labor, and power. A woman's fever after childbirth was also a household crisis. A king's weakness was also a political crisis. A child's illness was also a future suddenly uncertain. Children themselves entered life under this shadow. Infancy was fragile in ways modern audiences often underestimate. The first weeks could be especially dangerous. Infection, poor feeding, respiratory weakness, fevers, diarrhea, cold, and complications from birth itself all threatened survival. Families loved their children fiercely, but they also lived with a practical awareness that not every child would remain. This did not make attachment weaker. If anything, it could make tenderness sharper. Baptism came quickly not because parents were emotionally distant, but because spiritual care began immediately. Naming, swaddling, feeding, watching for signs of strength. These were acts charged with hope and fear. Wet nurses, especially in wealthier households, added another layer to this world. Breastfeeding was not simply a private maternal act. It could be tied to labor demands, status, and survival strategies. A woman weakened by childbirth, pregnant again too soon, or working under heavy domestic pressure faced impossible calculations. Infant care was intimate but also economic. And childhood sickness continued long after infancy. Measles, fevers, stomach illnesses, respiratory infections, accidents, malnutrition. Children moved through a dangerous landscape where ordinary play and ordinary disease could both turn serious quickly. A child's body was resilient in some ways and frighteningly vulnerable in others. For parents, this created a form of love shaped by vigilance. Watching for rash, listening for breathing at night, wondering whether a fever was ordinary or the beginning of something worse. The same emotional architecture exists now, but without modern hospitals, that uncertainty was heavier. Sometimes all one could do was wait, cool the forehead, pray, and hope morning looked different. That act of waiting returns again and again because it was the real center of illness. Not the physician's visit, not the rare dramatic operation. The waiting through fever, waiting through labor, waiting beside an infant who would not feed, waiting after a wound to see whether redness spread or receded, waiting for someone to ride for a priest, waiting for the physician to return, waiting to hear if the plague had reached the next village, waiting for the church bells to stop because they had been ringing too often. Medieval medicine lived inside time, and time could be merciless. This was especially true during famine years, when sickness and hunger folded into each other so completely they became almost indistinguishable. Malnutrition weakened the body, illness reduced the ability to work, poor harvests deepened poverty, and weakened households became more vulnerable to the next disease that passed through. Health was tied to grain as much as to herbs. A failed harvest could mean more than hunger. It meant poorer resistance to infection, worse recovery after childbirth, children weakened before winter, elderly bodies unable to survive the cold. The physician might be summoned for fever, but the deeper diagnosis was often poverty. This is one reason medieval illness cannot be understood only through medicine. It must be understood through bread, fuel, weather, and labor. A sick person in a warm stone manor and a sick person in a drafty cottage were not experiencing the same disease, even if the fever read the same. Winter made this brutally clear. Cold itself was not an illness, but it shaped almost all of them. Damp bedding, smoke-filled interiors, poor ventilation, respiratory disease, weakened joints, isolation from travel, limited fresh food. Winter turned ordinary sickness harder. Nights lengthened. Firewood mattered. A cough in autumn could become something much darker by January. For the old and the poor especially, winter was a medical season. And in that season, care became even more domestic. The best medicine might be warmth, broth, rest, and someone willing to keep the fire alive through the night. This sounds simple because it is simple, but simplicity does not mean ease. Fuel costs labor. Broth requires food. Rest requires someone else to carry the work. Even kindness had an economy. Perhaps that is why medieval illness reveals social character so clearly. It asks not only what people believed, but what they were willing to do for one another when belief met inconvenience. Who gave bread? Who visited? Who avoided the house? Who stayed through the smell, the fear, the exhaustion? And sometimes, when ordinary care failed and domestic remedies could no longer carry the weight, families turned outward once more. Not to the village healer this time, but to something older and larger. The hope that somewhere, at a distant shrine or sacred spring, a saint might still intervene where medicine had not. That hope could send people across astonishing distances. A sick child too weak to stand, an old man whose joints had stiffened into constant pain, a woman whose body had not recovered after childbirth, a pilgrim carrying an illness no physician seemed able to explain. These people or their families might turn toward pilgrimage not as a last dramatic gesture, but as a practical extension of care. If herbs had failed, if the physician's advice had run out, if prayer at home felt too still against the weight of suffering, movement itself became a form of hope. To travel toward a shrine was to refuse complete helplessness. Healing shrines existed across medieval Europe, attached to saints whose reputations grew through stories of intervention. Some were local, known only to nearby villages. Others became major destinations, drawing travelers from across kingdoms. A relic, a tomb, a spring, an image believed to be touched by grace. These places gathered not only devotion, but illness. Entire roads carried pain toward them. And it is important to understand that this was not separate from medicine in the minds of most people. It was medicine enlarged into sacred geography. A saint was not thought of as replacing practical care, but as reaching where ordinary remedies could not. If a physician could not explain why a fever returned each month, perhaps a saint could intercede. If childbirth had left a woman weak for years, perhaps healing required more than diet and rest. Pilgrimage was not necessarily a rejection of reason. It was often an acknowledgement of medicine's visible limits. The journey itself mattered deeply. Travel while ill was difficult, sometimes dangerous. Roads were slow, weather uncertain, inns unreliable, and the body already burdened. But this hardship gave the act seriousness. A family making such a journey was demonstrating belief through effort. Suffering was not only endured, it was carried somewhere. At the shrine, healing might take many forms. Some sought miraculous physical cure. Others sought relief from pain, protection from worsening illness, or spiritual peace if cure did not come. Offerings were left, candles were lit, vows were made. Stories were exchanged. People watched others who claimed improvement and imagined themselves next. And perhaps one of the most powerful medicines present, there was not supernatural in the narrow sense, but communal recognition. Illness isolates. A shrine gathered the sick together. Suddenly suffering was not private. One saw limping bodies, scarred faces, exhausted mothers, children held too tightly, old men leaning on others to walk. Pain became visible, shared, and therefore less lonely. This mattered. A person who had been sick for months in a single village, becoming defined only by weakness, could arrive at a shrine and become one among many human beings asking the same question. Can I be restored? Even if no miracle occurred, that experience changed the emotional landscape of illness. Of course, miracles were also reported, and many were believed sincerely. A child improved, a wound closed, a fever broke, a woman conceived after years of barrenness, a blind man claimed clearer sight. Modern listeners often rush to divide these stories into true or false, but the more historically useful question is what these accounts meant. They created networks of hope. They made suffering narratable. They gave illness a possible turning point. Not every cure was dramatic. Some may have been coincidence. Some may have been the body recovering on its own. Some were surely shaped by expectation, rest, better food, relief from labor, and the emotional power of being cared for. But for medieval people, the distinction was not always the point. If the body improved after prayer at a shrine, the experience was real enough. And if it did not improve, pilgrimage still offered something else: preparation. To arrive at a holy place and not be cured could still transform the meaning of suffering. Illness might be reframed as a burden to be carried rather than a punishment to be escaped. Fear could soften into acceptance. A dying person might return not healed, but less alone. This may be one of the most difficult things for modern people to hear clearly. We are trained to think of medicine primarily as cure. Medieval people often needed medicine to be explanation, companionship, and moral structure as much as intervention. When cure was uncertain, meaning became part of survival. That does not mean people were serene about it. They were often desperate. They bargained with God. They promised donations, fasting, changed lives. They feared they had been forgotten. But the framework allowed suffering to be placed somewhere larger than random misfortune. Relics themselves played a powerful role in this world. Bones, clothing fragments, objects associated with saints. These were treated not as souvenirs, but as points of contact between earthly suffering and heavenly power. To touch, see, or be near a relic could feel like standing close to possibility. Again, to modern minds this can sound strange, but consider the emotional logic. If someone holy had once lived, suffered, and been transformed by divine grace, then physical proximity to what remained of them seemed meaningful. The body mattered. Medieval Christianity was not a religion that treated flesh as irrelevant. Incarnation, resurrection, saints' bones, all of this gave matter spiritual importance. So illness and relics belonged to the same imaginative world. Some shrines specialized in particular needs. Certain saints were associated with childbirth, others with plague, eye disease, epilepsy, madness, or wounds. This gave sickness a map. Pain had destinations. A mother with a sick child did not simply pray into emptiness. She knew where to go, whose intercession to seek, what stories others had told before her. And stories were everything. A shrine's reputation grew because people repeated what had happened there. Healing became social memory. My cousin went there. A merchant's son recovered. A woman from the next village walked again. These accounts mattered not because they were scientifically verified, but because they built trust inside ordinary life. People followed narrative long before they followed statistics. This same pattern shaped the reputation of physicians too. The medieval physician, especially in towns and courts, was both healer and performer of authority. Clothing, language, books, instruments, and manner all mattered. A physician needed knowledge, but also the visible appearance of knowledge. Patients wanted confidence, and confidence often came through ritual. Examining urine carefully, asking structured questions, prescribing in measured terms, referring to known authorities. In some ways, this is not so different from modern medicine. We trust competence partly because it looks organized. A waiting room, a white coat, a chart, a confident explanation. These are rituals of reassurance. Medieval medicine had its own versions, but trust was fragile because outcomes remained fragile. A physician whose wealthy patients recovered gained prestige. One whose patients died too often could lose everything. Medical reputation depended heavily on witness. Word spread. Families talked. Servants observed. Households remembered whether the doctor seemed wise or merely expensive. Cost itself shaped access. Learned medicine was often for those who could pay. The poor relied more heavily on family, charity, and local healers because consultation itself could be a luxury. This created a strange inequality. The people most vulnerable to sickness often had the least access to formal treatment. Yet wealth could also create its own medical traps. The rich had access to expensive ingredients, elaborate regimens, and physicians eager to demonstrate skill. Sometimes this helped. Sometimes it produced excessive intervention. Restrictive diets, repeated bleeding, costly imported compounds, aggressive purging luxury could become its own form of suffering. Meanwhile, a poor family's simpler regimen of rest and broth might, in certain illnesses, prove gentler and more effective. This is not to romanticize poverty. Poverty killed constantly, but it reminds us that medicine is not always improved by complexity. Sometimes the body needs less ambition and more patience. One place where ambition often failed dramatically was dentistry. Tooth pain was among the most common and relentless forms of suffering. Medieval diets, rough bread containing grit from grinding stones, poor oral hygiene by modern standards, and the absence of preventive care made damaged teeth a frequent misery. A bad tooth was not a small inconvenience. It could disturb sleep, make eating painful, cause swelling, fever, and in severe cases become genuinely life-threatening through infection. And there were few elegant solutions. Extraction was the most obvious answer, but it was feared for good reason. It was painful, risky, and dependent entirely on the skill of the person doing it. A barber surgeon, a local practitioner, or someone known for pulling teeth might be summoned. There was no modern anesthesia. There was force, speed, restraint, and hope that the problem ended rather than worsened. People delayed this for as long as they could. So much of medieval sickness involved delay. Delay because treatment was expensive. Delay because hope remained that pain would pass on its own. Delay because intervention itself was frightening. A person might live for months with worsening suffering simply because the available cure felt like another form of violence. This pattern extended beyond teeth. Hernias, stones, cataracts, infected wounds. Many conditions hovered in that terrible space where doing nothing hurt, but doing something might hurt more. And still people chose. They chose because life required function. A merchant needed sight. A farmer needed legs. A mother needed strength enough to stand. The medieval body was not asked to be comfortable. It was asked to keep going. Perhaps that is the quietest truth in all of this. Illness was measured less by abstract diagnosis than by interruption. Can you rise? Can you work? Can you carry water? Can you knead bread? Can you survive winter? Can you bury your dead and still return to the field? Health was ordinary usefulness. That is why recovery could feel almost miraculous even when it looked small. The first day out of bed. The first meal finished without nausea. The child laughing again after fever. The mother walking after childbirth. The old man managing the steps to church unaided. These were victories, though no chronicle recorded them. History remembers kings surviving illness because kingdoms depended on them. But most medieval victories over sickness were domestic and invisible. A family made it through winter. A wound closed. A child lived to spring. A widow survived grief long enough to keep the household together. These were the true triumphs. And when they did not happen, when the fever worsened, when the childbirth turned silent, when the priest left the house with nothing more to say, another part of medieval medicine began, one that mattered just as much as cure. The care of the dead, and the burden placed on the living who remained to explain, remember, and keep going. That care began almost immediately, often before grief had fully understood what had happened. Death in the Middle Ages was not only an emotional event. It was also a practical one, and practical necessities do not wait politely for mourning to organize itself. A body had to be prepared. Family members, neighbors, or religious attendants might wash it, arrange it, wrap it, and place it properly for viewing and burial. Candles might be lit if they could be afforded. Prayers were said. Bells could mark the passing. The room that had held sickness now changed its purpose. It became a place of farewell, but also of obligation. This transformation mattered deeply because the dead were not thought of as simply gone. Medieval Christianity imagined death as passage, not disappearance. The soul still required prayer. Memory still had consequence. Burial was not just disposal. It was participation in a moral and spiritual order that connected the living and the dead. To die badly, to die suddenly, without confession, without preparation, without witnesses, or without proper burial, carried a particular fear. It suggested disorder, unfinished business, vulnerability. A good death, by contrast, involved not only spiritual readiness but social recognition. One should be seen, named, prayed for, and placed correctly in the memory of the community. This is why funerary ritual mattered so much. Even poor households with few resources tried to preserve some form of dignity. The details varied by wealth and region, but the principle remained. The dead deserved structure. Burial connected the person back to land, family, parish, and God. A grave in consecrated ground was not simply symbolic comfort. It represented belonging, and belonging mattered even after death. For the living, grief was rarely allowed the luxury of abstraction. A widow mourning a husband also faced immediate questions of survival. Who would work the field? Who controlled the rent? What happened to debts? A father burying a child still had to return to labor because the rest of the household remained hungry. Sorrow lived beside tasks. This does not make medieval grief smaller. It makes it sharper. Modern people sometimes imagine the past as emotionally hardened because death was common. But frequency changes logistics, not love. A mother losing a child in the 13th century did not feel less because infant mortality was high. She still knew that child's face, habits, voice, the way they slept, the small ordinary details that make attachment real. What changed was that grief had fewer illusions of rarity. And grief repeated. A family might bury multiple children across years. A woman might survive childbirth and then lose the infant weeks later. An elderly parent might outlive sons lost to fever or accident. These were not singular tragedies neatly framed for memory. They were woven into life itself. This repetition created a relationship with mourning that was both familiar and exhausting. People developed rituals because they needed containers strong enough to hold recurring pain. Prayer for the dead, anniversaries, masses, almsgiving in memory of the deceased. These were not decorative religious habits. They were ways of continuing love across absence. There was also the matter of reputation after death. Medieval people cared deeply about how they would be remembered because memory had practical force. A person remembered as generous might receive more prayers. A person remembered as cruel or dishonest left a different inheritance. The moral record of a life mattered. Wills reveal this clearly. They were not only about property. They were moral documents. They named debts to be settled, gifts to churches, support for widows, protection for children, payments for prayers, and attempts to repair relationships before silence became permanent. To arrange one's death properly was part of arranging one's life. And once again, illness created that opportunity. A lingering sickness gave time for moral housekeeping. Sudden death stole it. This is one reason plague was so terrifying beyond the physical suffering. It threatened the structure of dying itself. Too many deaths too quickly meant fewer witnesses, rushed burials, interrupted ritual, and the collapse of ordinary mourning. The community's ability to honor the dead could break under the weight of numbers. Imagine church bells ringing so often they no longer feel like individual grief. Imagine graves dug faster than stories can be told. Imagine a mother unable to perform the rituals she believes her child deserves because too many others are waiting for burial. This was not only epidemic disease. It was spiritual disorder. Yet even in those moments, people tried to preserve meaning. They prayed harder, gave more, remembered names, held to fragments of ritual because fragments were better than nothing. Human beings are stubborn about dignity, and dignity mattered not only for the dead, but for the sick who were still watching. A person lying ill and hearing funeral bells from nearby houses was receiving a message about their own future. Medieval illness was never isolated. You knew how others died. You had attended their burials. You had watched neighbors vanish after winter fevers. Mortality was communal knowledge. This created a strange intimacy with death, but not necessarily peace. Familiarity can breed dread as easily as acceptance. A person might know exactly what came next and fear it more because of that clarity. Children grew up inside this awareness too. They saw mourning rituals. They learned prayers for the dead. They watched adults lower bodies into earth and continue speaking of them afterward. Death was not hidden away. It was part of education in being human. And still, life insisted on continuing. Fields needed planting. Bread needed baking. Animals needed feeding. The ordinary world did not pause long for grief, and perhaps that itself became a kind of medicine. Work could be cruel in its indifference, but it could also save people from drowning inside sorrow. Routine reasserted life. A widow still rose at dawn. A father still repaired a fence. A child still asked for supper even after burial. Survival often looked like ordinary repetition rather than dramatic resilience. This is where illness and recovery begin to blur again. Mourning had bodily consequences. Grief exhausted. Sleeplessness weakened. Appetite disappeared. People became sick after loss, not metaphorically, but physically. A surviving spouse might decline within months. An elderly parent could seem to lose the strength to continue once companionship was gone. Medieval people noticed this. They may have described it through melancholy, sorrow, or spiritual heaviness rather than modern psychology. But they understood that grief lived in the body. A broken heart was not merely poetic language. It could look like a real medical decline. And because of this, care for the bereaved was also part of medicine. Community mattered again. Shared meals, visits, prayers, practical help, presence. These were treatments of a kind. Loneliness could be as dangerous as fever. There is something deeply revealing here. The medieval understanding of sickness was broad enough to include the social fabric itself. A person alone was more vulnerable. A person remembered, visited, prayed for, and supported had better chances. Not always of cure, but of endurance. This is perhaps why monasteries, guilds, and parish life mattered so much. They created systems of obligation. People were not expected to face illness entirely as isolated individuals. In practice, of course, many were neglected. Poverty and exclusion remained brutal realities. But the ideal itself was collective. Suffering should be witnessed. And when it was not, that absence was felt sharply. To die poor, unnamed, or unprayed for represented more than sadness. It suggested a fracture in the moral order. Charity toward the sick and burial for the dead were considered serious duties partly because abandonment threatened everyone's sense of what a Christian society was supposed to be. This is also why hospitals and religious houses carried such symbolic weight. Even imperfect care represented a claim. The vulnerable should not disappear unseen. But not everyone received equal compassion. Certain illnesses carried stigma that complicated mourning itself. Leprosy, visible deformity, mental disturbance, diseases associated with sexuality, or conditions interpreted as moral failure could isolate people before death and after it. Sympathy was uneven. Communities judged. This judgment could be cruel. A person might suffer twice, first from the illness, then from the suspicion attached to it. Families could feel shame where they should have felt only grief. A body marked by disease became a story others told about morality. And yet, medieval religion could cut in both directions. The same culture that feared visible illness also venerated suffering saints, honored humility, and praised care for the unwanted. Compassion and judgment existed side by side, often inside the same person. A priest might warn against sin and also spend hours beside the dying poor. A town might exclude lepers and still fund their care. Human moral life was inconsistent then as now. One particularly difficult category was suicide, which medieval Christianity treated with profound seriousness because life was understood as belonging ultimately to God. While people certainly experienced despair, self-destruction was framed as spiritual tragedy, not private choice. Communities struggled to interpret such deaths, and burial practices could reflect that tension. The response was often harsh, shaped by theology and fear. But beneath doctrine there were still human beings trying to understand unbearable suffering. Records can sound severe, yet one suspects that private grief inside families was often far more complicated than official language allowed. This reminds us that historical people were rarely as simple as their institutions. And perhaps the same can be said of physicians themselves. We often remember medieval medicine through what it lacked. No antibiotics, no germ theory, no anesthesia worthy of the name, no modern surgery. All true. But if we stop there, we miss something important. Many practitioners were observant, serious, and genuinely committed to easing suffering. They were not fools trapped in darkness. They were intelligent people working at the edge of what their world could know. They watched patterns. They argued over causes. They preserved texts. They improved practical surgery slowly. They recognized contagion imperfectly but sometimes effectively. They valued diet, environment, and emotional state in ways that were not entirely misguided. Their failures were often the failures of historical limits, not personal stupidity. This matters because contempt is a poor way to understand the past. If you had lived in a smoky house, watched children die young, buried neighbors after winter fever, and never seen a microscope, you would not think about sickness the way you do now. You would think with the evidence available to you. And within that world, much of medieval medicine was an earnest attempt to create order inside uncertainty. Sometimes it succeeded, often it did not. But perhaps the most honest measure of medicine is not whether it defeats death entirely, because no medicine ever has, but how it helps people live with vulnerability. By that standard, medieval people built something more complex than the caricature suggests. They built households of care, rituals of dignity, systems of charity, practical remedies, spiritual frameworks, and communities that tried, however imperfectly, to keep suffering from becoming complete abandonment. Still, the body remained stubborn. Fevers returned. Winter came again. Another child coughed through the night. Another woman entered labor. Another old man discovered that the pain in his side was not leaving this time. Another physician examined urine by window light and tried to name what could not yet be named. And somewhere, in another small house near another field, someone sat beside the bed listening to breathing slow, wondering whether to hope for recovery or whether, before dawn, they would need to begin preparing the body for burial and the living for the long work of continuing without it. And that work of continuing was, in many ways, the final and longest chapter of medieval illness. Recovery and death are dramatic because they feel like endings, but most of life happened after them. After the fever broke, someone still had to rebuild strength. After burial, someone still had to reopen the shutters, relight the hearth, and decide what to do with the clothes folded at the foot of an empty bed. Illness left traces long after the body changed state. A household after sickness was often not the same household. If the patient survived, recovery could be slow and uncertain. Medieval medicine did not imagine healing as a neat return to normal. Convalescence mattered. Weakness lingered. A man who survived a serious winter illness might not return to the fields with the same strength. A woman after childbirth might remain exhausted for months. A child who survived fever could stay thin and fragile long after the danger seemed over. And this lingering weakness had consequences. Labor in the Middle Ages depended on bodies functioning reliably. There was little room for partial capacity. If your hands shook, if your back failed, if walking remained painful, your economic life changed immediately. A surviving illness could quietly turn a family poorer. A father unable to plow, a mother unable to manage household work, a servant too weak for daily labor. These were not medical footnotes. They were structural changes. This is another reason medieval people feared sickness so deeply. Survival was not always victory. Sometimes it meant entering a slower kind of hardship. Chronic disability was part of ordinary life, though often hidden in grand historical narratives. Limps, damaged hands, partial blindness, deafness, recurring pain, poorly healed fractures, weakness after infection. Many people carried permanent reminders of past illness. Some adapted successfully. Others became dependent on family, guild support, charity, or religious institutions. And here again, community determined whether survival felt like mercy or burden. A skilled craftsperson who lost some mobility might still contribute through knowledge rather than labor. An older woman weakened physically might remain central to household management or childcare. A man unable to farm might survive through kin networks strong enough to absorb him. But where support failed, disability could slide quickly into poverty. Begging, especially for the sick, elderly, or visibly disabled, was part of the medieval social landscape. Charity toward such people was encouraged as a Christian duty, but dependence was never emotionally simple. Public need exposed private vulnerability. To ask for bread was also to surrender dignity in ways people felt sharply. Some hospitals and confraternities offered support. Guilds in towns could sometimes protect members through mutual obligation. Monasteries and parish charity helped unevenly, but illness constantly tested the limits of compassion. It asked whether society truly believed its own moral claims. This is one reason miracle stories and saints' lives mattered so much. They were not only spiritual entertainment. They taught communities how to see suffering. The poor sick body at the gate could be read as inconvenience, or as a test of your soul. And yet, ideal compassion did not erase ordinary impatience. Families grew tired. Caregivers became exhausted. Poverty narrowed generosity. Medieval life was full of people trying to be good while also being hungry, frightened, and overworked. Love existed, but so did resentment. An aging parent needing constant care could become both beloved and burdensome. A husband weakened for years after injury could be pitied and silently feared for what his weakness meant to everyone else's survival. Illness did not create saints. It exposed ordinary human limits. This emotional realism is important because history can become dishonest when it turns suffering into moral theater. Medieval people were not endlessly noble in the face of illness, nor were they cruel by default. They were complicated. They argued over costs. They grew impatient with pain that lasted too long. They loved fiercely and failed each other regularly. Sometimes the sick person themselves changed. Long illness can alter temperament. Pain shortens patience. Exhaustion creates silence. A person once lively may become withdrawn, suspicious, or hard to comfort. Family members had to navigate not only the disease but the changed personality around it. Medieval sources hint at this in small ways. Complaints about difficult invalids, moral advice about patience with the sick, warnings against bitterness in suffering. There is something timeless here. Illness changes relationships because it changes time. Conversations narrow around symptoms, care schedules, fear, and interrupted routines. Love becomes practical. Sometimes that deepens intimacy. Sometimes it exposes fractures that health had hidden. Marriage especially could be reshaped by prolonged sickness. A spouse might become nurse, financial manager, emotional anchor, and future widow or widower all at once. Promises once spoken in ceremony became daily labor. Lifting, feeding, waiting, listening, deciding. We often romanticize medieval marriage through politics or property, but sickness reveals its real architecture. Who stayed through weakness? Who kept the household standing? Who forgave irritability born from pain? This is also where servants enter the story, often forgotten. In wealthier households, servants did much of the invisible labor of illness. They carried chamber pots, changed bedding, fetched physicians, rode for priests, prepared food, watched through the night, and handled the physical realities others preferred not to name. Their intimacy with sickness was often profound, yet poorly remembered because service itself disappears easily from written prestige. A noble's survival might depend as much on the servant who kept water warm and noticed a dangerous change at midnight as on the physician who visited by daylight. Children, too, were shaped by watching illness. A child growing up in a medieval house learned early that bodies fail. They learned which herbs were fetched for fever, how adults' voices changed when worry entered a room, what funeral bells meant, why everyone suddenly moved more quietly. They learned that care was work. This education was not formal, but it was constant. It created adults who understood sickness not as an interruption of life, but as one of its expected companions. That expectation shaped courage differently. Medieval people could be afraid of illness without being surprised by it. This distinction matters. Modern medicine often promises interruption can be prevented. Medieval life assumed interruption would come eventually. The question was not whether, but when and how one would meet it. Some met it with stoic practicality, others with prayer, anger, humor, bargaining, or denial. Human responses were never uniform, but there was often less illusion that comfort was guaranteed. And comfort itself was understood differently. Today, treatment often means intervention. In the Middle Ages, comfort might mean warmth, company, prayer, broth, clean linen, music, or the presence of someone trusted. A person dying slowly might not be offered cure, but they could still be offered dignity. This distinction between fixing suffering and accompanying it is one of the deepest lessons the period quietly teaches. Sometimes accompaniment was the entire medicine. Monastic infirmaries understood this well. A monk too weak for prayer still remained part of the community. A nun with chronic illness was not simply an inconvenience. She became part of the moral work of patience for everyone around her. Religious life did not remove pain, but it could give pain a shared framework. Even kings discovered this. Royal sickness was a reminder that power was bodily fiction. A king unable to rise from bed was still technically sovereign, but authority looked different when delivered through whispers behind curtains. Courtiers watched symptoms like politics. Succession anxieties sharpened every cough. Rumors spread faster than treatment. A ruler's illness revealed how much a kingdom depended on one fragile human body. And those bodies could be surprisingly ordinary in their suffering. Gout, infections, digestive disorders, injuries from riding or war, chronic pain, fevers, depression, weakness after campaigns. Royalty did not escape the basic humiliations of flesh. Gold did not reduce toothache. Titles did not stop childbirth from being dangerous. This visibility could be strangely democratic. Common people watching a noble household mourn recognized something familiar. Illness crossed rank even if treatment did not. There were also illnesses that remained socially invisible because they were embarrassing. Digestive problems, bowel diseases, urinary stones, sexual illness, infertility. These carried silence. People still sought help, but often through quieter channels. Shame shaped medicine. A person suffering from something intimate might delay treatment not from ignorance, but from humiliation. This reminds us that medieval modesty was not simple prudishness. Bodies were morally and socially read. To reveal certain forms of weakness risked judgment. Privacy, where possible, protected reputation. Infertility, especially, could feel like a social illness rather than a private one. In a world where marriage, inheritance, and labor were deeply tied to children, the absence of pregnancy created pressure from every direction. Remedies, prayers, pilgrimages, blame, quiet grief. This was a form of suffering often absent from dramatic histories but central to many lives. And because medical knowledge was limited, blame often fell unfairly. Women especially carried the burden of explanation, even when the cause was uncertain or male. Illness again became moralized through gender. This pattern repeated across the whole landscape of health. Women's pain could be dismissed as expected. Men's weakness could be judged as failure of strength. The body was never neutral. Perhaps that is why saints of healing often attracted such devotion from women. They offered not only hope of cure, but recognition. A shrine listened where households sometimes did not. A vow made in prayer could hold grief that ordinary conversation could not. And sometimes the illness itself became identity. A person long sick was remembered through it. The woman with weak lungs. The old man with the bad leg. The child always recovering from something. Illness entered names. It shaped marriage prospects, household roles, expectations of the future. Health was not an abstract state restored by medicine. It was a biography. This is one reason medieval records, when they mention sickness, can feel so intimate. They are not describing diagnoses alone. They are describing social position. To be ill meant to occupy a different place in the web of obligations around you. And still, life kept insisting on ordinary joys. People laughed while recovering. Children played between epidemics. Lovers married despite knowing childbirth was dangerous. Families planted gardens beside graveyards. Bread was baked the day after funerals. Music was played in houses that had recently held fever. This is perhaps the most trustworthy thing to remember. Medieval life was not defined only by suffering. It was defined by the stubborn coexistence of suffering and ordinary happiness. Illness was constant, but so was the refusal to let illness become the whole story. A child surviving winter was celebrated. A mother rising from bed after difficult labor mattered. A grandfather walking to church again after months indoors felt like victory. People marked these returns not because they were sentimental, but because they understood how uncertain they had been. And that uncertainty never disappeared entirely. Even after recovery, people listened differently to the body. A returned cough carried memory. A familiar pain in the side meant fear. The person who had nearly died once rarely moved through ordinary illness the same way again. Survival leaves vigilance behind. So the medieval sickroom was never just a temporary place. It followed people outward, into work, into prayer, into marriage, into how they loved children and feared winter and counted blessings after small recoveries. And somewhere, always, there was another illness beginning. Another fever in another house, another woman entering labor, another messenger being sent down a muddy road for the physician, the midwife, the priest, or the quiet healer beyond the fields whose knowledge lived in herbs, memory, and the dangerous hope that perhaps this time, the body might choose to remain. And perhaps that is the final truth about being sick in the Middle Ages. Most people were never waiting for perfect health. They were waiting for enough. Enough strength to stand again. Enough breath to make it through winter. Enough recovery to return to the field, to the workshop, to the kitchen, to the road, to the ordinary life that suddenly looked precious the moment illness threatened to take it away. History often remembers the spectacular. The plague carts, the surgeons' knives, the royal deathbeds, the miracle shrines crowded with desperate pilgrims. But most medieval sickness lived somewhere quieter than that. It lived in a mother pressing her hand to a child's forehead by candlelight, in a husband counting the slow breaths of his wife after childbirth, in an old man deciding whether today's pain meant decline or simply another hard morning, in a servant keeping the fire alive through the night because warmth itself might be the difference. That was the real medicine of the age. Not certainty, because certainty was rare, but persistence. People used what they had: herbs, broth, prayer, bloodletting, shrines, physicians, midwives, neighbors, saints, luck, and endurance. Some of it helped, some of it harmed. Much of it simply made suffering feel less lonely. And that mattered more than modern people sometimes realize. Because illness was never only about the body. It was about belonging. Who stayed when the fever worsened? Who came when the bells rang? Who helped carry the dead? Who remembered your name after the grave was closed? To be sick in the Middle Ages was to discover very quickly what your world was made of: family, faith, poverty, fear, kindness, routine, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might feel slightly better than today. And strangely, that makes medieval sickness feel less distant, not more. The remedies were different. The explanations were different. The risks were often harsher. But the deepest human experience remains familiar. The fear of pain, the embarrassment of weakness, the quiet bargaining in the middle of the night, the relief when morning brings improvement, the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer, the ordinary miracle of recovery that no historian records. A child laughs again after fever. A mother survives. An old wound finally closes. Someone rises from bed and walks back into sunlight. That too was history. And perhaps it is why the Middle Ages should not be remembered only as a darker, more primitive medical world, but as a world where people faced vulnerability with fewer tools and yet with the same stubborn human instinct we still recognize: to comfort, to explain, to hope, and to keep going. They feared sickness because they understood life clearly. They knew how quickly a body could fail. They knew how much depended on one person staying alive. They knew that survival was often built from very small things: a bowl of warm broth, a neighbor willing to sit through the night, a priest arriving in time, a midwife who had seen this before, a saint someone still believed might listen. And they also knew that sometimes, despite all of it, the body would still leave. So they buried their dead, prayed for them, and kept planting in spring. They mourned and still baked bread. They carried grief and still made room for children to grow. They lived beside illness, not because they were stronger than us, but because they had no choice except the same one every generation eventually faces: to continue. If there is one detail from this world worth carrying forward, perhaps it is that. Not the bloodletting bowl, not the plague mask, not the dramatic myths we attach to the past, but the quieter image of a small room, a low fire, tired hands, and someone refusing to leave the bedside of another human being. That is what medicine looked like for most people, and in some ways it still does. So the next time medieval history is imagined only through castles, kings, and battles, it is worth remembering the other rooms, the warm, dim, frightened rooms where history was measured not in crowns, but in whether someone survived the night. And maybe that is the most honest history of all. If this part of the past surprised you, I'd love to know: what detail felt hardest to imagine living through? And what piece of everyday medieval life would you want us to explore next? If you enjoy these calm, deep dives into the strange realities of history, stay with the channel. There is always another forgotten room in the past waiting for us to quietly step inside.